Good afternoon. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies. We're housed at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is a unit of the City University of New York. And bear with me for our regulars because we have such a large audience of attendees today, many of whom may not be familiar with the center. The center was named for Christian Regenhard, a 9/11 probationary firefighter who perished in the collapse of the World Trade Center. And we're honored today to have Christian's mother, Sally Regenhard, on the line with us. This topic is so important and so central to the center's formation and the center's work around high-rise fire safety. And so it's really a distinct honor and a pleasure to have Peter Apps joining us today to discuss his work. First in covering the Grenfell Tower fire and the lengthy inquiry. And I think, judging by the caliber of our audience, and I see many colleagues on the line today, I think there's a strong consensus that Peter was the definitive voice, journalistic voice for the coverage. While there was great reporting done by others, I think Peter was, for the virtue of his consistency, and I think his ability to accurately portray the technical aspects of the fire and the investigation. And so I've just finished reading the book a couple of days ago, and I just want to start off by thanking Peter for really just an incredible work. I think the breadth with which he started in terms of looking at historic fires, so the antecedents, the way he was able to weave together the details of the fire response, centering the survivors and victims of that fire, I think is often overlooked. And so I think it's going to be something of a standard reference for those of you interested in building safety and building regulation, as well as people obviously interested in high-rise fire safety. Peter wrote this book, obviously, from the perspective of the UK and regulations in London in particular. But I think it's apparent to anybody who follows the topic or has been able to read the book that there is a tremendous amount of information here that is widely relevant to the architectural engineering, fire engineering communities. And many of the challenges presented in the book, I think, are very much alive and faced by us here in New York City. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the question and answer. So again, I just want to thank everybody for attending. Thank Peter in particular. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Peter, to get us started.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Charles, and thanks for the kind words as well. Yeah, I mean, I think I hope that what you said hopefully resonates, because I think one of the real things there that you said about our coverage was the sort of consistency and the ability to kind of translate the technical information without necessarily dumbing it down, and we always saw that as our kind of number one challenge, really. So I'm pleased if that's worked, basically. So I'm gonna just start. I'm interested to take questions from Charles and take questions from everyone who's taken the time to come along tonight, especially people from the US and from overseas who might not be that familiar with the aftermath of Grenfell, what's happened in the UK, what's happening right now. I'm really keen to explain all that, but I thought I'd just kick off with an explanation for an international audience of what the Grenfell Tower fire was, what happened, and what we know and why. It was, of course, a facade fire. I think that's probably well known. It was a cladding product called aluminium composite material, which was two metal sheets bonded together with polyethylene plastic. Now, polyethylene is derived, as I understand it, from the same oil that we use to produce petrol. So the plastic in those panels was quite literally solid petrol. And on the night of the fire, it's a plastic which ignites at quite a low temperature. And so when a fire, what was a routine kitchen fire, started in a fridge freezer, broke out of a window on the 4th floor of Grenfell Tower, it ignited the polyethylene inside those cladding panels, and it took a fire very, very rapidly up the outside of the building. That's happened around the world quite frequently. I think there's a couple of instances of it happening in the US, but certainly it's happened in the Middle East many times before Grenfell, and several times afterwards as well. Grenfell then became different from all of those cladding fires that we've seen before for a couple of reasons. The first being that when the fire reached the top of the building, rather than burning out and leaving a sort of vertical column of burnt out kitchens as it might have done in another type of cladding fire, it ignited what was an architectural crown at the top of Grenfell Tower, and that meant the fire started to spread laterally. So as well as going up the building, it spread around it. And that meant that you had, rather than a single facade on fire, you ended up with all 4 sides of the building burning. And meanwhile, inside the tower, the smoke which was burning, coming from the cladding panels and the plastic insulation burning on the outside of the building, started to spread very, very rapidly through the interior of the tower. And the primary reason for that is thought to have been the absence of self-closing devices on the flat entrance doors. The landlord of Grenfell Tower was it counts as what we call in the UK social housing or public housing. I'm not quite sure of the term in various American states, but it's essentially any housing that's provided by the government for people on lower incomes to live. So you had effectively an arm of the state as the landlord in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and they'd failed to maintain those fire doors to the right standard, despite a specific enforcement action from the London Fire Brigade telling them to do so. And so as people fled their kitchen, the fire broke into their kitchens and they fled their flats, the doors didn't swing shut behind them. And so pitch black, very toxic, very hot smoke filled the landings and the lobbies very fast. And that meant that when other residents were alerted to the fire and opened their front doors, they were faced with a very intimidating smoky conditions through which they felt that they couldn't escape unaided. And so what they then did was phone 999, which is our 911, as I'm sure you're all aware, and speak to the London Fire Brigade. And the London Fire Brigade reverted to their standard operating advice with regard to high-rise fires, which is to stay put. UK buildings are not quite unique, but I think almost unique in that we don't have second staircases, we don't have communal fire alarms, we don't make any sort of plan B for what to do if a fire gets out of control. We build buildings based on the expectation that a compartment, a single flat, will hold and contain the fire for long enough for the firefighters to extinguish it. And the London Fire Brigade and the other fire services around the UK just hadn't considered really before Grenfell what to do if that assumption failed. And so these people were told to go back into their flats, to stay put and to wait for firefighters to rescue them. But unfortunately, over the next couple of hours, the operation became complex and difficult. The information about where people were was poorly communicated between the call center where they were phoning up, to the incident ground, to the firefighters inside the tower who were going up and down doing what they could. And as a result, by morning, the sun came up over London, and the sort of world became aware of what had just happened overnight. 70 people had lost their lives. Two more lost their lives in the months afterwards, bringing the death count to 72, which makes it the UK's most deadly peacetime fire since World War II, and by a distance the most deadly cladding fire around the world. We've seen lots and lots of instances of buildings facades going up in a way not dissimilar to Grenfell Tower, but only one where so many people have died. And what's come out since is a story about the failures of our government to be ready for that, the failures of our government to regulate the materials that we used on the outside of buildings, the failures of the landlords, particularly the social landlords in this instance, to maintain buildings to a decent standard so they could resist fire, a failure to properly be assessing and cataloguing the risks in buildings, a failure of the fire brigade, which I've mentioned, to plan for fires that take unexpected turns, and then a shocking series of failures by corporations to make sure the products that they were putting on the market were safe. And in fact, in complete reverse of that, what they've tended to do is discover that products were unsafe through testing, but instead of either improve the product or remove it from market, hide that testing and continue to sell it. And that information has slowly dripped out during a public inquiry, which has lasted, I think, from very first hearings to very last, about 4.5 years. And we've been there. I worked for trade magazines, worked for professional audience, and we've been there from those first hearings to the very last ones, which were just a few weeks ago. Writing it all down and sharing it as widely as we can. And so I've brought all of that information together in the book, which Charles kindly mentioned at the start. And I hope it tells a story which tells us something first about the UK and the way the UK government was. It was described by one of the lawyers to the inquiry as a lens through which we see how we are governed. So I see it as a broader thing than just one tower block fire. This is a story about why governments don't act in time to stop these things, and why they are unable to regulate or unwilling to regulate the actions of corporations who don't have safety as a priority. And I think, and I expect, not being an expert in US policy in any sense, that a lot of those lessons would apply in America in the same way or in a similar way. So, you know, I'm here to talk about everything that's in that book, and hopefully have a good discussion with Charles and with you guys. So I'll pause there to see if Charles wants to sort of throw any questions at me in the first instance.
Well, I didn't want to be too shameless, but I'm assuming anybody who cared enough, and the book is priced quite reasonably, and so please, by all means, purchase the book. If I thought, well, I won't start in on attacking local politicians right off the bat. I'll save something for later. But if I thought they could read, I might give the book out to more widely. But certainly it's highly pertinent. So the first thing, Peter, when we had the degree of attention, and you have and I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but in the UK and I think to a lesser degree the Commonwealth countries, this whole notion of oversight of fatal accidents or fatal incidents, or should I say fatal events, where they have a coroner and there's a coroner's inquest, and the coroner actually publishes findings that, not, in the US, a coroner just says, well, the person died from smoke inhalation and the coroner's done. Where in the UK, the coroner actually investigates the causal factors that led to the cause of death. And there was a long precedent for that. But I think the notion of 4.5 years of public hearings over the fire is a little foreign to most. So what set the levers in motion to actually get the Grenfell Tower Inquiry moving?
Well, that's a really interesting question, actually. And there's a couple of things. There's something else I sort of want to pick up with what you were saying about coroner's inquests. But the inquiry, first of all, was set up by the UK government, I think a day, certainly within the first 24 hours of the fire. And there's a certain amount of cynicism about that, some of which I think is justified. The civil servant, we have different departments in UK government, and the department that was responsible for housing its chief official, had just found out the scale of the failures of her own department in preventing this fire. She'd had conversations with the team who was specifically responsible for it. And I think there was a realization there and then at the higher levels of UK government that they were part of this story. This thing that was evolving on 24-hour news bulletins around the world was a UK government failure, as well as other failures, but it was on their watch and on their doorstep. And they reacted to that with the establishment of a public inquiry. Now, I don't know how familiar the concepts of public inquiries are in the US, but in the UK, the legislation, it creates a body, effectively. It creates a body with power to demand documents, to order witnesses to attend at the with a sort of backstop penalty of criminal liability if they don't. And then it is given a term of reference by ministers about what it should investigate, what it should find. It's a fact-finding operation first and foremost. And it's also powered to make recommendations to ministers within those terms of reference. And the inquiry has been a very powerful fact-finding tool. It's cost the UK government quite a lot of money. I think that it's run, the last time they published their accounts, took it to more than 150 million. But it has forced the disclosure of documents, astonishing documents from corporations who would never otherwise be putting those into the public domain. And it has produced a record of failure, which, you know, is captured in a book, but which we'll talk about today, but just wouldn't have come to light without that process. So I think there's some rightful cynicism, I think, about the motivation of the government in setting up the inquiry to begin with, because it allowed them to avoid every question people like me were asking by saying, well, that's something that's going to be decided in a public inquiry. It pushed the most difficult revelations for government right to the end. So the revelations about government's actions only really came out sort of January and February this year. And it gave them space to kind of make their own decisions about how they were going to reform building regulations and all that sort of stuff without the full story quite being public. So it gave a lot of breathing space to government. Nonetheless, I think that it having a legal body like that with those kind of legal powers has delivered, you know, revelations that journalists like me would never get anywhere near. So I that's where I kind of stand on the inquiry. I have some cynicism about how it was set up, and then a lot of respect for the process that's actually happened. You mentioned coroner's inquest. The Grenfell Tower Inquiry is not a coroner's inquest. But what was a coroner's inquest was there was a fire in 2009, also in London, in a tower block called Lacknell House, which killed 6 people, 3 of them children. And 4 years after that fire, there was a 50-day coroner's inquest. And as you rightly said, a coroner's inquest in the UK can involve what's called a narrative verdict, where in this case, a jury agreed on a statement of a description of failures that had led to these people dying. And that coroner then wrote to government departments. She wrote to the London Fire Brigade. She wrote to bodies representing the housing sector and so on, advising them on ways that they could change in order for this disaster never to be repeated. She wanted the UK government to review its guidance in regard to the external spread of flame over high-rise buildings. She wanted reviews of the stay put advice, and she wanted sprinklers, which is not a feature certainly not in older buildings in the UK. And none of that was done, really. In the 4 years since, our governments at every level failed to implement those recommendations, and it's part of why Grenfell was a very avoidable tragedy, because we had that lesson. We had that very public, quite high profile fact-finding exercise, which had the kind of real bite of being the result of 6 deaths. And I think if you'd have just picked up those findings and implemented them, Grenfell wouldn't have happened. So it's I mean, we do have these processes in the UK by which facts emerge and by which recommendations are made, but unfortunately what we don't have is any sort of process for ensuring they're implemented. And that's a real problem for for those things, because it's the important bit. So yeah, few things coming out of that question, but back to you, Charles.
Okay. Well, and I'm, this we'll get back to the fire momentarily, folks, but I just want to get some of these other things to the setting. The whole issue of substandard, or what is now acknowledged as substandard cladding on housing across the country now. I mean, it's the whole market is in turmoil, and people are being faced. Basically, nobody's figured out how to pay for removing the dangerous product that has already been used in construction, right? So where does that stand? I think you're okay.
It's a very it remains in a real stalemate, to be honest. So what emerged? Grenfell was, rather than being a one-off disaster as a result of, say, a dodgy contractor, a bad piece of building work or something. Grenfell was, I think, that the sort of the inevitable conclusion of regulatory failure in the UK. And the clearest way to exemplify that is that after the fire, this cladding panel, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, which has the sort of solid petrol plastic core, the UK government immediately started looking for other buildings, other tall buildings above 18 meters is where we draw the line in the UK for a tall building, which had that material on their walls. And in the course of the 5 years since, they found 500. Now there's the best estimates, there's 12,000 high-rise buildings in the UK. So it's not it's not a small percentage of all the UK buildings had that material on. We've made some progress removing that specific material, but the problem is the regulatory failure was wider than just one material. The standard which allegedly allowed that material to sort of sneak through allowed a lot of other materials that were unsafe to sneak through in the same way. You think of like what we call high pressure laminate, which is just sort of wood stuck, very thin layers of wood bonded together with glue, and will burn extraordinarily fast as a result. Or polystyrene, which is, the same material which you make polystyrene cups from, and it's turned into foam and stuck onto the walls of high-rise buildings. So we have these 500 buildings with the same stuff as Grenfell, and then hundreds of thousands of with other types of materials which we either believe to be dangerous or know are dangerous. And then you've got medium-rise buildings below that 18-meter line, low-rise buildings as well. And all told, you've probably got somewhere in the region of 10 or 15,000 multi-occupancy blocks of flats which need some sort of remedial work. And the question has been from the start, who's going to pay? Because that's almost a blank check, really. I mean, the UK government has very reluctantly put up some money, but it's always been keen to draw a line around, say that this money will only cover X, it's not going to cover Y. And there's always been that huge bill about who are we going to fix these buildings at all is the first question, and who is going to pay. And unfortunately, the way the law works in the UK, and this is where I'd love to learn a little bit more about how it functions in the US, but major works in buildings, multi-occupancy blocks of flats, are funded by the residents. So people who lived in these buildings suddenly found themselves getting £20,000, £50,000, sometimes even £100,000 bills landing on their doorstep because the developer that had originally constructed their building and had since gone bankrupt and been folded into a complicated company structure and couldn't be found anywhere, had used very dangerous combustible materials on the walls. And that process continues today. I mean, 5.5 years on, there's been some legal protection to say that if you've got dangerous cladding on your walls, you don't have to pay for it as the flat owner, but it's still far from clear who will. And as a result, you have people who can't get a mortgage. The bank won't give them a mortgage because the place is a fire trap, or at least seen to be a fire trap. And so they stay stuck, really. I mean, and the toll that's taken on people's mental health is huge. people have sort of there was a survey that someone did shared with us, and something like 85% said that their mental health had deteriorated really seriously. I think somewhere in the region of 1 in 20 were having suicidal thoughts. So when people have lost jobs because they can't move house, because they can't get a mortgage, marriages have broken down, they've lost the chance to have children, and it really has turned into this UK-wide crisis, which drags in almost all bundled together about the population of a large UK city, of people who happen to live in buildings where there's fire safety issues. And really, I mean, the government's made some progress by giving them a level of legal protection, but they haven't set out anything like a clear plan about how we're going to start dealing with that.
Okay, and as an example of kind of ongoing, even absent kind of the refurbishment or retrofit of this, of getting rid of those materials, there are a large number of buildings that are subjected to what they call the fire watch or a waking watch, where the building occupants are basically are forced to pay for someone, basically a 20 or overnight attendant to patrol the building.
It was the first solution proposed by the National Fire Chiefs Council, which was the sort of the overall body of fire chiefs in the UK, was to get in what's called a waking watch. So, and that means security guards, and security guards probably on a pretty poor salary, to be honest. I mean, with no fire training, and these guys aren't firefighters. And their job is to patrol the building 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in order to raise the alarm if a fire happens, so as to evacuate the building. Because, as I said at the top, UK buildings tend not to have communal fire alarms installed. I mean, it's a terrible idea for any number of reasons. The first being the cost of it. 5 members of staff, 24 hours a day, even if you're paying them the minimum the law allows, that still adds up to an awful lot of money over the course of months and years. And secondly, it's utterly ineffective. There have been numerous fires where those people will run through 2 corridors blaring an air horn and then run out of the building themselves. And I don't blame them for that, because they're young students trying to get a bit of part-time work to fund their degree, or people who've arrived in the UK looking for work and have found it. People with a security license will be doing nightclub entrances at the weekend. They don't have any idea how to successfully evacuate a block of 150 flats in the middle of the night, which is on fire. Nor should they be asked to, frankly. I mean, but there's a lot of sticking plaster solutions that have come out after Grenfell, and I think that's one of the most extreme. But it's cost people lots and lots of money. I mean, individuals have paid £800 a month for the privilege of that, which has doubled their mortgage.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. I'm trying to keep things a little thematically organized, but we've got one here from Brian Meacham. The question is about the regulatory state and how these panels came to kind of slip through, or I guess they didn't really slip through. They walked straight through the process, which you spend a tremendous detail in the book, talking about kind of the misdeeds and failures, of which there were many. But you just want to talk about the relationship between kind of building regulations, fire safety orders, and products, and how products end up getting through that, because it's pretty analogous to what happens in the U.S. in terms of how it works, but I think it's maybe a little more stark because at the national level in terms of the role of industry.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's an interesting question from Brian, and I think it kind of there's an important question at the nub of it, which is, who is to blame? Is it the government for setting the wrong standards and having a poor regulatory system, or is it the industry and the people that sold the products for sticking the wrong things on buildings and selling poor products to begin with? And I think the only possible answer to that, really, on the basis of the evidence, is that it's both. Both are, and all parties are to blame. And I think, sort of unpack that a little bit, the regulatory system in the UK is what's known as performance based, and I'll try and answer this question without getting too bogged down in technical detail. But rather than having prescriptive legal standards for you must use a product which meets X standard or Y standard as a matter of law. What we have in the UK is a headline standard which says that the walls of the building you build must adequately resist the spread of flame. And they leave it over to the industry to ultimately figure out what that means. The idea being that state regulators don't know as well as industry practitioners how to build a safe building. And so they create a standard which says build a safe building, and then they leave it to them to work out how to do it. Part of the problem is that as well as doing that, they also publish sort of non-mandatory but official guidance. So on the one hand, you're kind of handing over power to the industry to say, innovate, figure it out, you're the experts, you know what to do. You're not going to be told what to do. But on the other hand, they're publishing prescriptive guidance, which says, but here's an official document which says if you do X, Y, and Z, you will have complied with the regulations. And that is, it's almost a kind of worst of both worlds scenario, because people think that they have the freedom to not pay that much mind to the regulations, but they also have this guide saying if you've done X, Y, and Z correctly, you're not going to be you're going to be found in compliance, and you're not going to face any legal difficulty. So what you have is people taking those standards in approved document B, which is the name of the guidance, and just hitting the minimum or even below the minimum, and just thinking that that's fine, and that the enforcement being done by poorly paid and overworked inspectors who don't really have the technical competence to challenge what's being done. There's lots of specific ways in which that sort of Swiss cheese has had extra holes added to it. I mean, the most egregious is we used the standard before Grenfell called Class 0. And I appreciate I'm getting a little bit technical here, but it didn't really assess the whole of a product. It more just looked at its surface, really. And so if you have something which is faced by aluminium and then has solid petrol in the middle, it can pass that test because the fire test is only really looking at the surface of it. And it was just inappropriate for modern building methods. And I think the really damning thing to have come out of the inquiry is that the government knew that. They knew that from as early as 1991, when there was a fire, a pilot cladding scheme in the northwest of England, which exposed that Class 0 standard was inappropriate. And they found out again in 2001 when they ran some internal tests, which they never released, by the way. They never made public. This was released by the inquiry, where they tested a cladding system which included the actual ACM material used on Grenfell Tower. They built a 9-meter test rig and set light to it, and they saw flames go 20 meters above the rig, had to terminate a 30-minute test after 6 minutes because they knew that, because they feared that the laboratory they were using to test it would burn down. And they were told in the report to that the Class 0 standard means that this product is available and on the market and can be used on high-rise buildings. And there was some fiddling with wording and some confusion around what exactly various standards applied to, but they never took that standard out of the document because there was quite a powerful industry lobby which wanted it, because it meant that they could sell almost anything they liked, because it was very easy to obtain this standard one way or another. So that's the government's culpability, and viewed like that, it looks quite bad. But then if you look at the industry, for one, the contractors and the builders on the ground had this legal standard which said you must build a safe building, you were legally required to, and they didn't really pay any mind to that at all. If they could get away with it and if it was cheap, they would use Class 0 materials with no assessment of whether or not it was appropriate, whether it would resist the spread of flame or not. They didn't take that legal responsibility and say, right, we're the experts, we're the innovators, we're going to figure out how to build a safe building. They took it, and they took the freedom, and they reduced their costs as much as they possibly could and boosted their profit margins as much as they possibly could. And I think anyone who kind of understands construction and the way construction operates as a sector would tell you that is what would happen if you set up a regulatory system like that. Unfortunately, the government didn't see that coming. But the manufacturers of these products, like I alluded to again in my opening comments, just to take the cladding, Arconic is a US company. It's spun out of the Aluminium Company of America, which was founded in Pittsburgh in the 19th century and is a giant of American industry. There is a real offshoot, sort of split up the company, and an offshoot down in France, but part of that same structure. They tested their products, this ACM, in 2004 to get a standard against new European fire safety standards that were coming in, and they realized that if you had it as a flat sheet, so you fit it to a building with rivets as a flat sheet, it's okay in a fire. It's not good, but it's not terrible. But if you bend it over so that you can hang it as a second way of fitting it to a building, so you sort of bend an L shape in it and clip it onto a rail, once you do that, you expose much more of the polyethylene to the fire that starts, and it goes up like a horror movie. I think the official numbers were sort of 7 times as much heat release, 10 times the speed of fire growth, and 3 times as much smoke once it's fitted into that configuration. But Arconic say to themselves, well, we just sell it as a flat sheet. We don't bend it into any particular shape. That's for the contractor to worry about. So they keep that test quiet. Even after Grenfell, that test is kept quiet. It's not released to the market. Cassette ACM is still sold around the world. That test remains in Arconic's database. It's only during the inquiry that test is actually released and talked about. And so who do you blame within that circle? You blame everybody, really, is the only possible way of doing it. Government failed, but you can very easily make a case looking at contractors to say, well, they had a legal obligation to do better, and they should have done better. And you can look at the manufacturers of the products and say, well, you had testing which showed that this was unsafe, and regardless of whether or not you could find a legal reason that you could sell it, if you knew it was unsafe, you had an obligation not to use that loophole. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in summary, I always come back to the position of Grenfell is a very complicated story with many different parties, all of whom carry some level of blame. And the only way through it is to kind of hold very clearly in mind, one person's failure does not excuse another person's failure. They have all failed. It's more a question of which bit of the failure do they own. I hope that answers your question. Sorry, I went slightly off topic there.
Well, no, some of these are to some degree unanswerable questions, and you do a great job in the book. But I certainly would concur that there's plenty of blame for all parties. In this. Now, there was a clarification from it's like Ian Sanderson about we're talking UK wide versus England, and so I was an American. I'm probably indelicate and inappropriate with that, but pointing out that Scotland has a different building regulatory system. And so I don't want to tarnish Scotland.
I mean, I would say to Ian, he's quite right. Scotland got rid of the Class 0 standard in, I think, 2001 after the fire in just outside Glasgow, which he references. However, Scotland are not perfect. It took Scotland quite a lot longer after the Grenfell Tower fire to ban combustible materials in high-rise buildings. It's only just come in. So yeah, and there are dangerous buildings in Scotland as well. I mean, the UK is two-paced. England and Wales have failed in one way, and Scotland have performed better in this regard in some ways, but there are some of these structural failings that apply all the way across the UK.
Yeah. Okay. And just unethical. I think everybody could agree. Absolutely unethical behavior on the part of the manufacturers and certainly some of the regulators, as you point out, people who aren't adequately proficient with expertise, who were not really doing their job. You talked about one of the employees are doing the fire safety work, basically waving a wand and saying, "Oh, there's nobody in this building that needs assistance for evacuation." I mean, just a lot of compromise, which had a horrible outcome. And we are going to get to the building itself and the fire. I promise everybody. I just want to kind of stay on some of the regulatory issues here. What do you see? Because we have, I don't know if you know, recognizing any of the names. Peter, you probably undoubtedly are, but we've got some heavyweights in the fire protection engineering community on the call. And, I've been around long enough, as have many of them, when, performance-based design really came into being. And there was really a lot of pressure from within the industry, obviously, to enable innovation, better value, and all those things. And then there's always this tension because there's this assumption of an adequate supply of competent professionals. And having been into this regulatory regime for I don't know how many years, but quite a while now, what are your thoughts as someone who's done this research and sat through the testimony about the viability of that notion that we can support true performance-based design when it comes to issues of life safety?
It's it's, as you allude to, it's a complex and long-standing debate. I would draw attention to the fact that in the UK, after the fire, and only really following the lobbying of bereaved and survivors groups, the government took the decision to ban, enact an outright ban on anything combustible on a building above 18 meters. And fundamentally, that has worked because it is simple enough to be enforced. And I think that for me, and I don't pretend to be completely right on this, because I'm aware that there's so many very great minds that have kind of tackled this question, but as a slight outsider to sort of the engineering profession, a rule is only a rule if it can be enforced. And it was too difficult for the building control officers, as we call them in the UK, to really challenge the things that developers were saying, or their fire engineering consultancies were saying on their behalf in the years before Grenfell. They couldn't look behind what we called a desktop study, where you paid a fire engineer to review 6 different fire tests and say, actually, yes, my professional conclusion is that this building is safe. The inspectors have absolutely no chance of looking behind that and deciding that the reasoning is wrong. I mean, even if you've got probably 6 fire engineers to look at that sort of thing, you get 6 different answers. And so I'm in favor of prescriptive regulations, because there is a possibility that an inspector can turn around and say, well, actually, it says that it's supposed to be non-combustible and what you're using is made of plastic. So I like that. And I see a kind of accountability in it as well, because if there is a level of law which is enforceable, it also means that people who don't comply with it don't really have anywhere to hide. I mean, it was so difficult for the inquiry even to rule that the walls of Grenfell Tower were in breach of building regulations, even though I said there's that statutory requirement that the walls resist the spread of flame. And at Grenfell, the entire world got to see that they didn't do that. But it still was only after, I think, 2.5 years of the public inquest that we got to that conclusion. Simple standards make for accountability and enforceability. And that's why I think that until everyone talks about the need to have competency in the industry, the need to improve the ethics of the industry, and the need to kind of change the mindset of design teams and all that sort of stuff, I completely agree with all of that. But until we get there, we've just got to have a rule which says, if this is the standard and if you fall below it and something goes wrong, then you're off to prison. So yeah, I mean, that's my stance on it. But I do appreciate that my view is probably slightly coloured by the depth with which I've gone into this particular story. And there might be instances where there are advantages fundamentally to that flexibility. So yeah, I think that's where I stand on it.
Okay, it was a mild setup, but I know this is not the first time this discussion, and the shortage of competent persons to fill the positions within the regulatory regime remains an issue. and independent of Grenfell. Do you want to just talk briefly about I would call it the central government's oversight of fire safety, to include the fire services? It was a bit of a I don't know, it's a hot potato, as lousy analogy. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But basically, every few years I would check in the UK, and the fire service was under a new ministry, and it had been reorganized. It was moved here, moved there, privatized, and there were a lot of changes there. So maybe just kind of characterize that as a setup to, while all these things were happening, kind of the store was being not necessarily minded, but being reorganized and moved. It seems every couple of years.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I think so I think there's a few levels of it. So I think in the UK, first, when a building is built, or in the case of Grenfell, refurbished, but when there's a major construction job, the enforcement happens from in the first instance, well, in the past, it used to be exclusively a town hall, a sort of local government set up. There's an inspectorate team in the town hall who send one of their guys off down to site and make sure that all of the bricks are being put in the right way and all of that sort of stuff. We now have a kind of hybrid system where you can either go to the town hall and get the building control inspector to sign it off, or you can pay a private consultant to do it for you. So they introduce competition, as they would have called it, but in some ways they undermined the enforcement of the rules, because if you can always find another inspector, you can eventually find one who's going to say that your building's adequate. And I've seen private inspectors advertise their services by saying no building ever rejected. So that's the kind of process of building buildings and refurbishing them. But then there's what happens to buildings once they actually exist. Who's checking to see that our existing stock of buildings are safe? And that's where the fire brigade or the fire services in the UK come in, because they're ultimately, legally speaking, they're the enforcement authority. They're the ones who are gonna, rather than the police, they're the ones who are gonna come and either serve an order on you to fix the building, or in the worst instances bring some sort of criminal prosecution against you for failing to do so. The system in the UK was set up in 2005, I think, by Tony Blair, to place that responsibility in the first instance with the building owner themselves. It's sort of a self-certification system. So the building owner is obliged to find somebody to do a fire risk assessment of their building, and then they are supposed to address any risks that person finds. But there are no standards for who can be a fire risk assessor, and no competency criteria, nothing like that. The building owner can really, if I owned a big high-rise building, I could get my mum to come and give me a signed off safety certificate, and the fire brigade might not like it, but I'd be in complete compliance with the law. Then the fire brigade come in. The fire brigade can kind of do proactive assessments of their own. They can audit the risk assessment that the building owner is carrying out. They can make sure that any recommendations from those audits were fully implemented and that sort of thing. So they have that kind of backstop. First of all, it's the building owner that has to look after the building, and then the fire brigade kind of make sure that they're doing that job properly if the system's working as it should. The fire service in the UK is very fragmented. There's been a lot of what we call devolution, a lot of localism, where the powers are kind of moved out from central government to each individual fire service around the UK. And a lot of them have kind of interpreted the rules slightly differently, interpreted the ways they enforce them slightly differently. And it has kind of created a bit of a patchwork process. Particularly also, the fire brigade has been under financial pressure over the last decade, particularly, with their funding constantly being reduced, and in some ways by quite large amounts by central government. And many of those fire authorities will take the enforcement inspection jobs away first before they take away the front line, as they call it, the actual firefighters. And there's a logic to that. I mean, you want to have enough firefighters and enough fire engines so that you can respond to an incident. And if you get that by cutting back on the amount of inspectors you have and the amount of inspections they do and the amount of training they have and the amount you're willing to pay in order to get competent and, qualified people to do those jobs, that's the budget that's going to go first. And certainly in the case of London, that is what happened. They did not have the resources in a city as large and as complex as London, with so many different buildings of different type. They didn't have the competency or the money, frankly, to do anything like a proper job of enforcement before Grenfell. I believe they have got better afterwards. I mean, I don't think they're still not perfect, like who is, but I think that the London Fire Brigade's taken its enforcement responsibilities very, very seriously since Grenfell, and that they have caught, I think, they don't get enough credit for it, frankly, but they have caught a lot of dangerous buildings as a result of inspecting quite frequently and quite rigorously within the remit that they're given.
Okay, I've seen a comment here, which I think bears addressing, is that allowing the use of cladding material on Grenfell is not an example of the failure of performance-based fire engineering. It's an example of the failure of prescriptive fire engineering and poorly written prescriptive regulations. So I just want to acknowledge that from Ed. I mean, I think there's certainly, well, I know it's there's a lot there, but we can talk about it.
Hello, Ed, by the way. It's nice to hear from you again. I've spoken to Ed several times, and maybe I didn't explain myself properly when I was answering that prior question. I mean, the prescriptive guidance in approved document B was absolutely part of the problem. I mean, when I was sort of talking on about class naught and the implications of that is absolutely a key part. That we had a standard in our guidance which allowed dangerous cladding, and that's why we have dangerous cladding on our buildings. And that is just a fundamental truth that is very difficult to get away from. I think what I'm talking about, performance-based fire engineering, is that where the failure of performance-based fire engineering came in, I think, is that this expectation on the part of policymakers that, given that freedom, contractors, design teams, architects would take it seriously and responsibly and ask themselves really searching questions about what was safe and what wasn't. And instead what they did was take out approved document B, and as Ed said, go to the written prescriptive regulations, go to the basement level regulation in there and apply it. Although even with the case of Grenfell Tower, they didn't even do that because they used combustible insulation when the guidance said they shouldn't. So, yeah, I mean, I think the point was that I didn't see any evidence in the UK, and I'd be happy to discuss this with you at some point, Ed, but I've never really seen any evidence that those performance-based standards kind of lift the industry. I don't see people asking themselves the question, will this building adequately resist the spread of flame? How are we going to work that out? Fire engineers probably do, but people who build buildings on building sites don't. And therefore, what do they add? If we just end up with if we end up with a prescriptive system because people will follow the guidance to its bottom letter. So yeah, okay. But I mean, hey, I'll look forward to discussing that with Ed at some point.
Clearly, and this is, I think it's an important subject. We are going to turn the page on that now. So goodbye, regulatory framework. Let's now talk about the building stock of basically high-rise residential buildings in, England, wherever, use whatever geography. But the key differences, now you talked about it earlier, and some of it, I think probably the single most noteworthy dimension there is the kind of widespread use of a single stair tower in residential high rises, which of course, in the United States is anathema, and some have seized on that following the fire as a critique. But can we just talk about kind of the existing building stock, of which, and this is an area that we've talked about in reference to our own large fire here, Park Northwest, back in January of 22 with 17 fatalities, with a lot of similarities, but we'll talk about that later. Most of these buildings, one stairwell, correct?
Yes.
No fire alarm.
Yes.
No central building fire alarm systems,
Yes.
Individual smoke detector or smoke alarms within the residence units, right?
Yes. Yeah.
No public address capability.
That's right.
Okay. And of course, no sprinklers.
Mm-hmm.
Almost unheard of, right? In a residential, an existing residential high rise.
I mean, I think they became a requirement in new build over 30 meters in something like 2015.
Yeah.
I might have got that date wrong, but in the vast majority of the stock, because most buildings were built before that, is yes, unheard of, almost entirely, at least before Grenfell.
Okay. Now the other thing, I guess is I think those are the key, just laying those out to make sure everybody's aware of what's there. Now, do you want to just quickly kind of set us up at Grenfell, to the kind of give us a setting, a little bit about the building itself, kind of its milieu, and I'm throwing more into this question as I'm looking at the clock saying, okay, keep moving, Jennings, but just get us set up about, Grenfell. I mean, there was always a tendency, and I think there's a certain amount, if we want to be honest, among people, a certain amount of, I would say, stigma related to public housing, right? And council housing, as you put it. Obviously, it's not anywhere near that in the UK, right? Because it's so much more widespread. I think people, it's not the same as here in the States, I would assert, but I could see your reaction. But let's let that one go. And so, but there's always this thing that's thrown up is, oh, well, it was a building full of immigrants, whatever that is supposed to mean. Right. We had the same thing in the Bronx. It was the first thing that came up. Well, it was a building full of immigrants, and with a shoulder shrug and like, well, we don't really meaningfully interrogate what that means. Aside from the fact in the US, we kind of fancy ourselves being a nation of immigrants, and New York is a major port of entry. And so it's a place where people from all over the world come and get their start, much like London, a global capital. So what's the setup for the building itself? Number of stories, and I guess the refurbishment, and then just talk a little bit about the occupancy.
Okay. So 24 stories, 129 flats by the time of the fire, and 6 flats per floor. From the 4th story up, it's the same floor layout. So they're all arranged around the central lobby with a lift and stairwell core. So you open your door and you're on this lobby, and there's another door you go through to the stairs, and there's a lift. And during the refurbishment, there was the lower floors were office space and some community space and that sort of thing, and nursery, and those were converted into residential units in the refurbishment, which makes it slightly more complicated. In fact, in one of the things that happened in that, just a sort of side point, but a relevant one, the floors initially started from, because the residential used to start from the 4th floor, so they called that floor 1 because it's the 1st floor of residential, but actually the 4th floor of the building. And then when they added the floors in below, they didn't renumber. So you had flat 16 is on the 4th floor. And obviously firefighters who are used to buildings which are numbered much more coherently than that would hear I'm in flat 16, and they would assume they're on the 1st floor. And if they hear I'm in flat 46, they're going to assume they're on the 4th floor, but they're actually on the 7th. And it's a small factor, but it's one of the factors in what made the efforts to rescue people so complex on the night. Sorry, I don't know how much background noise you're getting through. My 2-year-old and a 4-year-old are having a bath next door. So
no, it's you'd never know. You're doing fine.
Okay, all right, good. Yeah, 24-story building and all the features that you described. It's a single staircase. relatively narrow, and no communal fire alarm, no means for the firefighters to send a warning signal of any sort to residents in their flats. If they want to communicate with them, they have to wait until they call 999, and then they'll connect to an operator, and that's the way the fire brigade communicates with people in the buildings. The only means they've got, other than shouting with loud hailers from the street. The building itself, and it's interesting you talked about Bronx and that shrug of the shoulders, I think you described it as, because that's absolutely something I see when people in the UK talk about Grenfell. The tower was, it was public housing, it was council housing, it was multi-ethnic, it was there were a large number of Moroccan families in there. There were a lot of Muslim families. There was Black and Asian people from all over the world. There was a number of white British families as well, some Europeans, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese people. And there was a real mix. I mean, there's a kind of this assumption that everyone who lived in Grenfell was poor. And that isn't true. I mean, there were poor people in the tower for sure. I mean, there was some people who'd recently come from Syria. They fled Syria as refugees, and the first place they found as home in the UK was in Grenfell Tower, and one of them very, very sadly was among the victims of the fire. But there are also people who lived in a tower for sort of 30 or 40 years and had a secure home, and did, some of them, you know, for want of a better word, fairly normal jobs. I mean, like, they worked in IT, they were nurses in UK hospitals, they were porters in hospitals. There was a guy who'd set up a chauffeuring business, which was very successful. He come to the UK from Afghanistan, having fled the Taliban originally, and he's an entrepreneur. He'd started this business, and it was thriving. There were, and then there were some people who were kind of doing better than okay as well, actually. I mean, we have this thing, which I don't, with my eye on the clock, I don't want to kind of get into the explanation of, but you can buy your council house in the UK. You can become a homeowner by buying it back from the government. And so some people have done that, and they'd either sold it onto someone else, or they'd become quite wealthy in some ways. And this guy worked for quite a high level position in an airline, and he was in Singapore on the night of the fire, and his wife was at home. So this was, and there was some architects as well. So a pair who'd graduated from Venice School of Architecture, and they're an Italian couple, sort of very glamorous, living on a very top floor of Grenfell Tower. And it was a real community as well. London is a city, from everything I hear about New York, it's very similar. I mean, you walk down the street with your kind of hands in your pockets and don't say hello to anyone, and your neighbor could be a serial killer, and you never know, because you've only seen them sort of glimpse them in the morning when they're going out to work, and that's it. That's sort of what London's like. But Grenfell Tower wasn't like that. It was people on each floor knew their neighbors. They meet each other at the lifts as they're waiting to take their kids to school. Children would play with each other. There were lots and lots of children in the tower. They all went to the same schools, so they all knew each other. And then as a result, families knew each other. And it had this real, it's a kind of trite expression, but people have kind of called it a sort of village in the sky type thing. I mean, like, there was real community there. And I think the loss of that building, there's so many factors that make Grenfell a huge tragedy. The deaths are the first and most important thing. People losing their homes is next. And then, but losing that community for people after the fire has been really hard. So yeah, sorry, hopefully that answers your question.
No, that's great. So I just wanted to follow up then. So I think the other relevant factor before we turn our attention to the fire is the guidance, the kind of firefighting and evacuation guidance of the London Fire Brigade. Now, again, the stay put policy, which is rightly, come under scrutiny, as much as it was from an observer standpoint, it's like, well, this is obviously, you've got to do something different here. We have a functionally, not nationally, but certainly here in New York, we have essentially the same policy in fire resistive high-rise buildings. Of course, they're all fire resistive if they're high rises, but the high-rise buildings, the guidance is basically stay in your apartment. Unless you're directly threatened. And so, and you make a really nice point in the book. You talk about kind of the guidance around stay put and some of the arguments that are made, the statistical, you could argue misuse of statistics, particularly when you're talking about, risk of, something only goes wrong once every, 2000 events. Well, yeah, well, that one thing can go wrong, could be a Grenfell. And so we do need to think about that. So talk about the London Fire Brigade. And I thought you did a great job covering, their kind of standard practice for firefighting. So let's talk about that briefly.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Ed Galeo, we had a little exchange with just now on the call. Says Grenfell Tower fire was first and foremost a failed evacuation, and that's a phrase I quote in the book, and one I wholeheartedly agree with. I mean, I don't know as much as I should about the recommendations to residents and how to behave in a fire in the US, but I think the problem that the UK had and the London Fire Brigade had was that stay put is fine as a plan A, and I'm quoting Ed a little bit here, but it works when it works, and it works well. I mean, like, you don't want to have to leave a building every time someone, put some tinfoil takeaway in the microwave on the 12th floor or whatever. In minor fires where the fire doesn't spread outside the compartment of origin, it works okay. I think that the problem that we had is that there wasn't just an absence of a plan B. There was an absence of any thought really as to what would happen if that plan B was needed. There was never any guidance, any training given to incident commanders in the London Fire Brigade on how to recognize that a fire is starting to spread out of control and what to do once that happens. Even if it's a sort of a managed evacuation or whatever strategy that you want to take, they place complete faith in stay put working in every incident, in every fire, and they never considered the implications of that faith not holding. And like I say, that failure was despite that faith failing 8 years before Grenfell at Lakanal House. That was a stay put failure as well. The coroner's inquest, which we talked about previously, found that all 6 of those victims could have escaped up until quite late, quite shortly before their deaths. If they'd have been encouraged to flee, they could have got out. And so there's quite a lot of things that go into that. I mean, one is there seems to be a distrust in the guidance and the policymakers and probably some senior people in the fire service as well, which continues to this day in the idea that people will be able to manage their own evacuation. They seem to think that as soon as people get into the stairwell and get out of their flat, they're just going to panic, they're going to run around, they're going to get trapped, and then they're going to need to be rescued. They're going to trample on each other, they're going to fall down the stairs, and they're going to forget where the exits are and all that sort of thing. And actually, Grenfell Tower shows that not happening more than it happening, because the people that did leave their flats, for the most part, where the smoke conditions allowed them to get to the stairwell, they evacuated pretty quickly, to be honest, and pretty calmly. And they often stopped on the way to help. There's short of kind of inspiring stories from Grenfell, but there's a very inspiring one where a guy met one of his neighbors who had polio, who was trying to come down the stairs, and he stopped at potential risk to his own life and helped his neighbor down the stairs. A guy he didn't know very well, just seen him around at the shops, and he took him out of the building. So there was never this kind of serious question asked of, if we need to get people out of the tower, how are we going to do it? And so that was kind of what then led to the other failures. The first firefighter on the scene, Michael Dowden, sees the fire break out of the 4th floor window and start to spread up the outside of the building. And he doesn't know what to do. Firefighting is all about policy and following procedure. And he didn't have any sort of training, policy or procedure to know what he was looking at, to understand what the implications of it were. I mean, he seemed to think that the fire might not break back through other windows, and despite the fact that it was a very warm night, windows were open, and glass is going to shatter in a fire. And so, yeah, I mean, the London, I talk about this for a long time, but the London Fire Brigade had been told by the coroner and then by government to review guidance with this issue in mind of when to reverse the stay put policy and what to do. And that there was such an internal resistance within that institution to anything other than stay put that they essentially refused to do it. The government had to kind of crowbar those references into the guidance themselves, because the London Fire Brigade just did not believe in doing anything other than telling people to stay put in high-rise buildings. And I think that says something about the kind of conservative nature of the organization, and certainly at a senior level, and just this unwillingness to ask and challenge the kind of difficult, unanswerable question. I think the firefighters come back often to, even now when their barrister presents at the inquiry, we can't solve this problem. They keep saying, we've got single staircases, we don't have communal fire alarm, so we just can't solve it. And I think that there was a bit of that feeling. They kind of felt that because it was a difficult question to answer, they just weren't going to ask it. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's some of that, among the fire service, right? If it's a difficult, it's somebody else's problem or somebody's responsibility. Let's talk about the fire now. So the fire starts on the 4th floor, right? And just kind of marches through the early stages of the fire and what's going on.
So it started in a freezer on the 4th floor. The fridge starts a small fire in the kitchen, which becomes a larger fire. And then it very quickly progresses towards the window. So there've been new windows added as well as new cladding during the refurbishment. And the window was built very poorly. It had a lot of kind of unprotected cavities in it, and it had a lot of combustible insulation surrounding it. And so that fire, as it attacked the window, effectively destroyed the frame quite quickly. And so the fire was able to get in behind the cladding and start heating up that polyethylene from behind, and then also come out of the window and heat it from the front. So the polyethylene was being attacked on two sides by fire. Polyethylene got hotter and hotter and then ignited. And so the fire started, as I said in my opening remarks, spreading up the building. Grenfell from the 4th floor up was arranged in the same floor pattern. So the flat started in flat 1-6. And so immediately above is the kitchen of flat 2-6. And so the fire goes straight up out of flat 1-6, breaks the window in flat 2-6 and sets that kitchen on fire. And then it goes up the building like that, 3-6, 4-6, 5-6, 6-6, all the way up towards the roof. And so the residents of these flat 6s leave immediately. They're alerted by their own smoke alarms or just by seeing their kitchens catch fire. And they go very quickly. And lots of them go out of the building and down the stairs and escape. Nobody dies inside a flat 6. But as they leave, their landlord has not maintained the fire doors on the flat entrances properly, and so the doors do not swing shut behind them. And so many of those doors stay standing open as the fire continues to spread from their kitchen and consume their furniture. The smoke spreads straight out of that door onto the landing. And now you have a landing which is increasingly not just smoke logged, but so full of smoke that as residents describe it, you wouldn't see your hand there in front of your face because of how thick the smoke was. And it's also incredibly toxic, very difficult to breathe, very aggravating when if you take a mouthful of that, you would choke and gag and tears would stream from your face. So people shut their front doors and call 999. And the fire then, as I said at the start, it progresses around the top of the building. some of the people from the flat sixes and from other flats who kind of woke up at the start, rather than going down the building, go up the stairs to the top, because they think that they're escaping from the fire by going up. And so a large number of people congregate in the flats on the top floors of the building. And then the crown, there's this kind of architectural flourish on the building, which ignites and starts spreading fire around the top of the building. So those flats where people are congregated at the top are they start to become involved in the fire, and many of the victims, a disproportionate number, were people who'd fled up to the top and died. And then progressively throughout the night, the attempts to rescue people largely fail. People are continually told to stay put until 2:35 a.m. in the morning, which is an hour and 40 minutes after the first 999 call. And by the time people are told to leave, that if that ever happens, they've inside their flats inhaled so much, because the conditions are worsening inside their flats. They've inhaled so much carbon monoxide that they do not have the oxygen threshold left in order to make a descent down the stairs. And so either they collapse and die inside their flats, or they make an attempt to escape, but because the fire is because the carbon monoxide levels in their blood are already so high, as soon as they breathe in the smoke on the landings and in the stairs, they die. The one thing I do want to emphasize, and just sort of looking at the clock, I just to bring it up, is that there was a large percentage of Grenfell Tower, partly because it was social housing, but not just because it was social housing, who had disabilities, mobility issues, in particular, who were unable to escape, not just because they were told to stay put, although obviously that's a massive contribution, but because they wouldn't have had the ability to walk down the stairs unaided. Grenfell had no adaptations for those people to get out of the building, and no plans were made for their escape whatsoever. The fact that they were disabled and would have struggled to evacuate in a building wasn't even something that was being recorded by the KCTMO, and as a result, of the various classes of people in the building, the fire disproportionately killed disabled people to a large degree. 41% of the people in the tower with disabilities of that type died in the blaze, and that's caused a huge conversation in the UK about the need to plan for the escape of disabled residents. But the UK government has rejected repeatedly the government's the Grenfell Tower Inquiry's recommendation to implement those recommendations. They've said it wouldn't be practical or proportionate to do so. And as literally this week, as my colleagues have been writing throughout the week, that they've had to go to court, sort of like it's our equivalent of going through a Supreme Court case to try and challenge a government decision, in order to try and persuade them to reopen that and actually think about, well, how should disabled people escape a high-rise building in the event of a fire.
Okay. And you had some really interesting details in the book about kind of the system within the fire brigade. The fire brigade's kind of, I think their thought process was so wedded to stay put that even after I think it was the deputy commissioner or assistant commissioner gave the order to, abandon stay put, tell everybody to get out of the building, even though the control room, or the dispatch as we call it, they resisted, right? They could not turn that switch off because it's kind of like muscle memory, right? It was there was some delay and inconsistency in whether people even got that message after the decision was made.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, some people were actively still told to stay put even after the call handlers were told to encourage evacuation. And many more were just not persuaded enough. I think the inquiry sort of did quite a good job of contrasting the fate of one family where the call handler said, you must leave now, otherwise you will die in this building, you must get out, it doesn't matter that it's smoky, you've got to go, to another one who is much more passive in sort of saying, if you think it's safe, if you think it's appropriate, try, etc. And in fairness to those call handlers, that they suffered from no training really and no preparation in how to help people evacuate a high-rise building. And they were always just told, tell people to stay put, and that's all they really had. I think another kind of relevant thing about the call handlers is for a very long time they didn't really know what was happening at Grenfell Tower, not clearly. It's kind of amazing to think, but there were no TV pictures in the call room to show the building being burning in the way that it was, and there was information coming back from the calls they were making and from the incident ground, but it was very piecemeal and very poorly communicated. So up until quite a late stage in the fire, many of those call handlers were operating under the impression that they were dealing with a fourth floor kitchen fire, when actually an entire building was on fire. And that happened to the extent that they would tell people, would phone them up and say, there's fire literally outside my window. And they'd say, well, where are you in the building? I'm on the 20th floor. And the call handlers would say to them, well, no, it can't be fire outside your window because the fire's in the 4th floor. And that is an extraordinary failure, really. I mean, everyone in the world by that point who had access to a smartphone or a television screen knew what was happening at Grenfell Tower, but the people who were giving advice to those staying in the building didn't. And yeah, I was of many sort of list of failures that make up this tragedy. That's one that's sort of sometimes overlooked.
Right. And I think was the dispatch facility a backup facility, or it was?
Yeah, that's right. So the normal they normally were in Southwest London and they were in East London for a night, and the TV was broken and there was an extra TV, but no one got around to turn it on. So yeah, sort of catalogue of unfortunate events, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and we'll talk some more about the peeps and the plan B, but there are precedents for this, absolutely. And one of the things that we've identified over the years is kind of the lack of learning from international experience within the fire services, and that there's this idea that, oh well, if it's it can't happen here because it happened in in England and everything's different here, and so we're okay. But reading the book, you see many of the issues, and of course the precedent incidents that you did a great job of identifying. There were actually some that I wasn't even familiar with, or one or two. And but we look here, have we had a similar situation? Absolutely. We've had it here in New York City. Back in 1987, the Schomburg Plaza fire started out as a trash compactor fire, flame, and I guess there were obstructions, but long story short, people on the upper floors of a high-rise residential building are calling dispatchers saying the smoke is unbearable in my apartment, and they're being told it's a trash fire on the 1st floor. And basically that went on considerably until people started jumping out of the windows. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, okay, I guess we've got a serious problem on our hands. And so, the other thing is that this you talk about I think one of the important things that comes out in the book is the amount of time, duration of which the building still remained tenable, or some parts of the building remained tenable, and people were alive and for an extended period. And the fire brigade was operating throughout that period under really dire and extraordinarily severe conditions, but they were making viable rescues well into the fire, and I don't think London Fire Brigade had the kind of typical system where a 999 call gets written on a piece of paper or a whiteboard, passed on to somebody, and and then the incident commander is accumulating a list of apartments that need to be checked. And you point out there that people had moved, and you did a great job of showing the complexities of the fact that people do relocate over the course of a long-term event. So the point of all that was to say that there are precedents, and we haven't really made any progress on that. We are still woefully inadequate as an industry on dealing with the large number of calls that we should anticipate getting from any high-rise residential fire, right? There are going to be dozens, if not more, calls coming in requesting that people are being checked on, and how do we manage that? And I don't think we've done a good job as a fire industry in advancing that cause in all these years since 9/11, which certainly was a wake-up call for we can't rely on staying in the building. There are going to be times when we need to do a full evacuation. So I don't know if that was a question. I think that was more of a statement.
Well, I mean, to sort of just take it up and run with it. I mean, the nub of what you're saying there, it came across so clearly in the module of the inquiry that looked at the kind of, not the London Fire Brigade on the night, but the London Fire Brigade in the years before Grenfell, and their failure to have that awareness that building failure can happen and could happen in London, because they looked actively at fires in Dubai and in the Middle East, to the extent that their fire safety team even had a PowerPoint presentation, which they took round to all fire conferences in the UK. And I think they were going to do one in the week of Grenfell Tower, where they talked about, hey, cladding materials are really dangerous. You could have a big high-rise fire, but they never took that and thought, well, what if it happens here? What do we tell our frontline officers to do? And even during their evidence in the inquiry, some of those people were saying, well, we just didn't think that could happen in the UK. We didn't think that it would happen here. And then the question is really, why not? I mean, what was it that you thought about the UK was so special that it wasn't vulnerable to building safety failure? And a bit of it is just that, that sort of, we are very kind of real tunnel vision for stuff that happens within international borders. And fire science doesn't change just because it's on the other side of a line on a map. It's the same. If it burns like that in the UAE, it's going to burn like that in London. And I mean, one of the extraordinary things post Grenfell is that there was a fire in Milan in Italy in I think early September last year, and that building, it transpired, had the same ACM cladding bent into the cassette form that was used on Grenfell Tower. And there's been no questions asked in Italy, as far as I can tell, after Grenfell about, oh, do we have any ACM? What should we be doing about our high-rise buildings? They just see a London issue and think that that's a London problem. And I think it keeps happening. And yeah, I mean, if we were to learn from international precedents as well as national ones, I think it would put us all in a pretty stronger position to deal with the next disaster. Whoever knows where it's going to pop up.
And you talked about people taking some measure of solace from the performance, life safety performance, and I'm reading that just in terms of a body count from the cladding fires, in the Mideast. But information about those, those are not necessarily the most transparent governments, and of course these are in recent buildings that are equipped with sprinkler systems, right? So obviously not comparable to a cladding fire on an unsprinklered building. And so certainly no name, I don't see an argument for taking a lot of comfort in those things. So the other piece I wanted to talk about was fire doors, and you talk about it explicitly. And this is a point I've tried to make for years. And some agencies have here in New York. The fire department is okay. Ed. The fire department has a distinct perspective with regard to fire doors, is that they treat it as a public education issue and enforcement issue, and it's really an impossible task in terms of trying to oversee the state of fire doors across the high-rise building stock any place. But I think you point out in common sense what I've tried to point out, but with little avail, is that it is not reasonable, to expect that all those doors are going to be maintained properly. It's secondarily unreasonable to believe that none of them would be impaired by something as simple as a welcome mat that got caught up in the door. And lastly, this notion that you are awakened from a sleep and there's a fire in your apartment and you're suddenly going to have the presence of mind to calmly close and latch the apartment door before you leave. I mean, I think it's a comforting fantasy, but I think it's a fantasy. And I think any building system, any life safety system that falls there, that basically falls apart as soon as one door is left open, is inadequate, right? And we've got to do better.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'm not a fire engineer, but it seems to me that the idea of compartmentation as a kind of infallible concept would have no windows and no doors, because once a fire can break through a window, even if it's a non-combustible facade on the outside, it's been known in the UK fire community since the 1960s that it can roll up the outside and smash the window above and start a fire in a floor above. And if you've got a door, that door even if you've got a self-closing device, it might work. Or the fire doors in Grenfell Tower, I've mentioned a couple of times now that the failure of the self-closers, but they also they only had, when tested, I think 15 minutes fire resistance. They were supposed to have 30, but they had, the new letterboxes added and new door numbers and eye peepholes and non-fire resistant glass and all of that kind of thing that meant that the fire could actually get through them much more quickly. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very fallible part of that system, a door that opens and closes, possibly made of sort of composite plastic with all kinds of door accessories in it, and needs to be fitted perfectly by an infinitely competent contractor who then repeats that perfect fitting 129 times throughout the building and then maintained completely. Like, I think it's obvious that fire doors will from time to time fail, and a fire strategy that doesn't take account of that possibility isn't engaging with the real world, in my perspective, from my point of view.
Okay, just keeping up with the chat here. So as we're rounding into the kind of the last period here, get your questions up. Let's talk real quickly, just because I wanted to bring it up before we finish. And I think there's plenty of discussion here to take us through the next 23 minutes. But what's going to happen now? Are we on to the criminal investigation?
The criminal investigation has been ongoing.
Okay.
So the Met Police began investigating not long after the fire, and they've been doing it quietly and in the background, but there's quite an expensive investigation with something like 180 detectives working on it. They've interviewed, I think the last time they made an announcement, they said they've interviewed 40 people under caution. And they're considering a range of charges up to manslaughter, but I think for a lot of potential charges might be things like fraud, health and safety responsibilities breached, potentially misconduct in a public office, which is a specific offence we have in the UK for people employed in sort of governmental roles who fail. The next step is for the inquiry to publish its report. That will probably happen in autumn next year. That's the date that the people in the know keep telling me. Nonetheless, it could take a bit longer. It's perfectly possible it could even be a bit quicker. I don't know. After that, it's expected that the Met will move quite fast. The Met Police will move quite fast to arrest people. It's obviously difficult to name names for fairly easy to imagine legal reasons, but I think that there are some prosecutions, given the evidence that's come out in the inquiry, that really are shooting fish in a barrel for a competent prosecutor. I think one of the things that in the UK, we draw a lot of parallels between Grenfell and a football stadium disaster called Hillsborough, where in the end, despite pretty strong evidence over the years of failure on behalf of the number of parties, but primarily the South Yorkshire Police, no criminal convictions have ever stuck. I think that a huge difference between Hillsborough and Grenfell that's not often commented upon is Grenfell happened in the digital era. And so there is a record of emails and messages and electronically held notes of meetings, which can't just be fed into a shredder and lost forever, that mean there is an enormous weight of evidence here. And if there is a failure to prosecute anyone, I'd be astonished. It would be a catastrophic failure of the criminal process. I think the better question is, are they going to get to the real culprits, or are they just going to kind of pick off the low-hanging fruit and wrap it up and call it a day? But we'll see how that progresses.
Okay. Yeah, just for clarification for everybody I'm not speculating on the impact of sprinklers on the Grenfell Tower incident itself. I certainly accept that a facade fire is not going to be extinguished by an interior sprinkler system, but we'll just leave that there. So I guess, is there any discussion or where do we go from here in terms of in the States, we use the term retrofit, right? And we have this large existing stock of tower blocks, high-rise residential buildings, many of them with no protection systems aside from compartmentation, passive fire protection, no alarm, no public address. Is there any move afoot, to require these buildings to have systems put in place?
So the focus has been in the UK from the top down sort of central government diktat. The solution that we should pursue is taking the cladding off the walls of these buildings. I think that there's a philosophy at the kind of top of the government system that these are inherently safe buildings. If you can remove all of the cladding, then they become safe buildings again, and then you don't have to worry about those more complicated questions about means of escape and communal fire alarms and potentially sprinklers and all of that kind of thing. So they're sort of fixing the specific thing that went wrong at Grenfell. Basically, that's what they're trying to do, which is, I think, a mistake. And it has it's given us this huge crisis in the UK, which I mentioned earlier, about so many buildings being dragged into this safety crisis. And the real problem we've got, as I see it, is that that's got so big that it's almost impossible to see the wood from the trees. It's very difficult to distinguish between a building that has some flaws in its external facade, maybe the use of combustible insulation behind some brick slips, or and one that's a real kind of potential disaster waiting to happen. There's no kind of really serious effort to break it down into, these are the real death traps, these are kind of moderate risks that we could probably live with so long as there's some form of escape plan or whatever, and these are the buildings which actually we can probably leave alone. And as a result, everything is being pulled in, and so many different people are being put under the pressure of living in a building where the safety case isn't proven, and therefore they can't get a mortgage and their insurance premiums go through the roof and all of that sort of thing. That then there becomes a sort of backwards pressure to sort of do nothing, because people start to say, oh, we've overreacted here, we're just kind of branding all buildings dangerous, and we just kind of need to get a grip on our common sense. And so we're caught between those two things in the UK. And I think really what needs to happen is some sort of clear-minded prioritization of the buildings that are really unsafe and the buildings that are tolerable, and also a stepping away from this obsession with the idea that you can simply remove cladding and not have a problem with building safety. And a more of a look at, well, there's going to be unsafe buildings. There are going to be unsafe buildings. Even if you build them all safe, over time, they'll become unsafe. And so what redundancies can we put in in order to make sure that when one of these fires happens, it doesn't become this horrendous mass fatality event like Grenfell Tower or even Lakanal House. And some of that comes down to evacuation and alerting people promptly so that they can get out of the building and empowering them to help their neighbours do the same. But that's not a route the UK government is really interested in. They just think they've got real tunnel vision for just strip cladding wherever it is, strip combustible cladding wherever it is, and then the problem disappears. And unfortunately, pursuing that approach has actually made the problem bigger, not smaller.
Okay, as we're coming into the home stretch here, any other questions? Please, now is the time to send them up. I've been following with one eye the back and forth on the sprinklers, so it's good to see that. I think Brian's Meacham's clever story here about a wise professor said one is a firewall, not a firewall, when you put a door in it. So there you go. What's the has there been any officialdom response to the book? The book's only been out, is it less than a month now, right? Or is it
yeah, it came out in early November. So
Okay.
far everything's been positive. I've had a few nice reviews. Couple of people have noticed spelling errors, but
Okay.
that's life. But no official response, and neither any legal letters, which is always welcome.
Yes, yeah, I hear you. So well, I let's just real quickly talk about the evacuation plans for people with disabilities. And you know, again, this is the guy in the glass house from the U.S. perspective. Let me get out my stones here and start throwing them at the you know, at London. You know, I mean, this is where are we with that? I mean, I guess it's going to be contested, this idea that they're not necessary. But and we've seen the, you know, the disproportionate share, and I thank you for your reporting on the fact that people with disabilities fared much worse in this fire, which a lot of times that information doesn't get captured. You know, where do you see that going?
I think so. I said in answer to a previous question, or maybe I sort of sped through it a little bit. So the end of the first phase of the inquiry, Grenfell Tower Inquiry, split into two phases. One which looked at the night of the fire and the events of the night and all that sort of stuff, and the other which has looked at the long policy and corporate background. The first phase report published in October 2019, so it's more than 3 years ago now, and it recommended that building owners should be required to provide personal emergency evacuation plans for disabled residents. They said into all buildings, but the government initially, the sort of British government led by Boris Johnson, said that they would implement every single recommendation of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. They said that categorically and on numerous occasions. But then what happened is behind the scenes there was a kind of pushback, basically. So there's some consultancies who've written fire guidance in the past in the UK who had advocated against that. They said it was usually unnecessary to provide those sorts of plans because of the stay put policy. And so that consultancy, which remains quite influential, along with the sort of representatives of building owners and managers, had kind of behind closed doors meetings with government where they said, actually, you shouldn't do this. It's going to result in the sort of waking watch issue that we talked about previously just becoming a permanent fixture, because you'll just have to put staff in these buildings and they'll just be standing there waiting to take someone out in an evacuation chair. And so the ministers listened to that. I don't think that they, and I'm sure Ed will tell you himself, but I don't think they consulted the right experts. I don't think they consulted experts at all, frankly. I think they consulted vested interests. And they decided to water that down to the point at which it was essentially abandoned. They weren't going to do it. They brand it neither proportionate, practical, or safe. Partly because in a sort of fairly shocking piece of the post Grenfell failures. They said that you can't evacuate disabled people because it might slow down able-bodied people getting out of the building, so they're just going to have to stay in their flats while the able-bodied population escape. So we've reached a position where the government's proposal is that we do something called information sharing. So the fire brigade get notified, and only if the building is known to be unsafe, so only if we know there's combustible cladding on the walls or some other major fire safety defect, everyone else just has to stay reliant on stay put. But if we know it's a dangerous building, there'll be a document for the fire brigade to consult, which tells them that there's a man in a wheelchair on floor 17 who needs rescue. And so they will have to then, if that's the policy that we do pursue, they'll have to arrive at an incident, if there's another incident like Grenfell Tower, and look at their list of 30 or 40 potentially people with disabilities and somehow get them all out of the building. And that obviously is deeply unsatisfactory, both to the residents of the relatives of those who died at Grenfell Tower with disabilities, and also people who live in high-rise buildings with disabilities, some of whom live in the buildings with dangerous cladding. And so there have been a number of legal challenges to that UK government refusal, the latest of which went to the High Court in London in a hearing that concluded on Wednesday, and we'll wait and see what the outcome of that is. So far, the government's a couple of times been told to go back to the drawing board. It sort of said the policy you've come up with is illegal for various technical reasons. You're going to have to come up with it again, but they've kind of done it again and ended up in the same place. I think, you know, Ed, who's currently very active in the chat, is obviously the UK's leading expert on this in my mind, certainly one globally, or authorities on this topic. He wrote an excellent piece for the website I work for, about how this could work in practice, how it could practically work, and how it's not disproportionate, it's not impractical, it's not unsafe. None of those things are true. There are ways of doing this which, albeit not necessarily perfect 100% of the time, are a hell of a lot better than the position we have now. And so it will continue to be, it's become a hugely emotional issue, this, for particularly the bereaved. I think they don't want to see this recommendation ignored, and they kind of feel like if it is, they will lose an enormous amount of faith in the inquiry process, full stop, because this was a pivotal recommendation of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. I should say that the inquiry recommended not only this personal emergency evacuation plan, it also said buildings in the UK should be retrofitted with a manual alarm system, so something firefighters could activate if they arrived at the building and found that the fire was spreading out of control. It also said the building owners should be mandated to create evacuation plans. All three of those have been ignored. So the government was essentially told that its total reliance on stay put and it's the absence of plan Bs was no longer acceptable. That was really the kind of philosophical conclusion of the inquiry, and the UK government has chosen to ignore that. So yeah, we'll see where it ends up. At the moment, you know, the Prime Minister of the UK changes every 3 weeks and the Housing Minister changes every 4 weeks. So you never know. We might get someone in who wants to take a different approach, but there's no sign of it yet.
Okay, Peter. That's it, folks. I put the link to purchase the book in the chat. If you haven't bought it already, I urge you strongly. I mean, it's kind of remarkable in a sense that we didn't really talk about the writing and the book per se. We talked about all the issues, which I think is a tribute to Peter, you know, as a good reporter, mastering the subject, and pulling together a lot of highly technical information and very human portrayals of those who were affected directly by the fire, as well as the kind of the rogues gallery, as in the Greek chorus, of those who sat on the sidelines, tried, did a little bit, but not enough. And I think there's certainly, as someone who works in this field, you know, reading the book, you know, it's I don't know how you take it as not something of an indictment of suggesting that you do more, right? And so Peter, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Inside Housing, which is a great publication. I don't know of anything similar here in the United States, where there really is a focus on kind of the built environment for regular people. We have fancy magazines that we look at penthouse apartments, but we don't have people who report on plumbing that doesn't work and issues like that. And these are huge issues, not just in our city, but across the country. And so thank you for your service to the fire industry. Thank you for your sensitive and thoughtful reporting. And I can only say it again, it's an excellent book. You got to buy it. I don't say that often, but you must purchase this book. And we look forward to monitoring this. And to all the experts who were on the call, thank you very much for your participation. And thank all of you. And this is not going away, right? And so we will continue to focus on this. If you're a one-off who are just getting into our center, real quickly, we have a listserv, and we publicize our events. We are going to hold more high-rise related events in the coming years. And so you may want to stay on our mailing list to see that something else comes up. So with that, I want to once again thank everyone for participating. And thank you, Peter, and best wishes, happy holidays for those of you who celebrate them. And take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for
Okay.
having me on.
Yes, quite welcome.